Well, good evening. I'm Chip Osborne on the board of Beyond Pesticides. I'm going to moderate this session. I'm going to carry on this message, and we're going to hear from people that have adopted this change and systems change and actually making it work in the real world. A couple of comments that I'd like to make before we start. The two speakers are leaders, absolute leaders in their fields. They understand how to manage, and they understand how to manage as a system. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about a change in management practices. So they're on the leading edge of what they do, leaders in their field, leaders for all of us. But all of us in the room are leaders. One of my favorite sayings is, we lead, others follow. And that's what all of us in the room here are doing. In our own individual ways, we're going out there and we're being leaders in this way, or this process of getting rid of these chemicals and moving into organic management systems. I think we understand now that pesticides only treat symptoms. They rarely, if ever, solve problems. We're taught by an industry and we're sold to us to solve that problem. But that insect, that weed, or that fungal pathogen is not necessarily the problem. It's a symptom of something underlying. We've been convinced that we need to constantly intervene with nature to manage unwanted plants. They can be in open space, they can be in agriculture, they can be in the playing fields where our children spend a lot of their time. In my work, I travel nationally, and I can tell you that interest in organic is growing. It's all around the country now. We've gone, just in the last 5 years, the acceptance and the willingness to explore these alternative strategies is growing. Municipalities, universities, students and decision makers. A young lady right here in the room, Mackenzie Feldman, doing amazing work in the UC system in California. One student starting something that is going to be huge, the kind of thing that we all can get involved in and support. In addition to my work and my consulting work, I train and work within the industry with grounds managers, decision makers, and try to teach them about a systems-based approach. And the one concept, if I spend 3, 6, or 8 hours with these practitioners in the field, the most important fundamental concept I need to get through to them is that they have to understand that the soil and soil health, and specifically the biological life in the soil, is central to any kind of success. So that's very contrary to everything that they've ever been taught. And they simply sometimes can grab it and sometimes can't. We're going to hear from people tonight that do that and show the proof that that actually works. Many times these guys want to know, just give me the least toxic product. Just tell me what I can use. Give me the right organic pesticide. And that's not what it's about. I think all of us in the room know that's not what it's about. So we have to change the way we think about managing, and we have to teach others how to think the way that we do and get them to change. So it's a systems change. A lot of times I'll give a talk and say, why should we go organic? And list all the reasons that Carolyn talked to us about. But you know what the one reason is? Because we want the landscape to get better. And I think those of us that do it always can show that we can get an improvement in the health of the landscape. So organic is not a product swap. We're not simply replacing one thing with another, but we're managing in a different way. When we attempt to intervene with pesticides as opposed to taking the systems approach that focuses on soil health, we will fail. So we need to just put aside those kinds of products and move forward. We get on the treadmill with pesticides that ultimately gets us nowhere. So we need to begin to stop treating symptoms and start solving problems. So again, as Carolyn said, we simply don't need pesticides. We have organic strategies work, and now we can meet a communicated set of expectations that anybody delivers to us, and we can do that organically. The last comment that I want to make is everything that we hear today, tonight, and tomorrow, each of us has to go and begin to realize that we have to institutionalize this all with policy. We have to take that next step where we get policy in place that gets it so that 5 years or 10 years from now, we're not going to fall back on this pesticide use. So all of us need to work and take it in that direction. So without anything further, I'd like to introduce our first speaker in this panel, Peter Del Tredici, PhD, is an esteemed botanist, is a former senior research scientist at Arnold Arboretum for 35 years, and a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Dr. Del Tredici is the author of a widely acclaimed Wild Urban Plants of the Northeast, a field guide, which is available out on the book table out there. Without any further ado, Dr. Tredici.
Well, this is a real honor. Now we'll get this PowerPoint fired up. To be here, this is a little bit outside the type of audience that I usually speak to. It's usually horticultural and botanical audiences. So I'm really looking forward to this. And, you know, and to follow Joan and her amazing talk, all I can say is I must have drawn a short straw or something like that. Yeah, that's it. Looks like it. There we go. That's the first slide. All right, and then just hit the arrow, right? Okay, I got the same computer. Perfect. So what I'm going to talk to you about, and Jay said, you know, try to be optimistic. So, so I thought, okay, I can be optimistic. I'll talk about climate change. How about that? No, it's really interesting because in the teaching that I've done over the years, the past 25 years, one of the things that, you know, depressing your students is not an effective strategy, okay? It doesn't work, all right? And, you know, what I say to them, I say, you know, what you're going to learn in this class is really about the future, okay? We don't care about the way conditions are today. That's not what I'm concerned about at all. What I'm concerned about is what's the world going to look like from 20 years from now? And that's what we're going to focus on in this class. And that really is what I want to talk to you about tonight. And I'm going to make sort of an argument, a case. And I'm not going to talk at all about food because that isn't anything that I really work with, although I have my own vegetable gardens and have been growing food for a very long time. But what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is this whole issue of what's happening to the ecology all around us. And the lens I'm going to be used to talk about this is really the question of invasive species. And I'm going to talk specifically about what's happening in the urban environment. And how do you begin to understand what is actually happening in the urban environment and how a lot of these plants that people refer to as invasive species are really, they get a bad rap. They get blamed for causing environmental degradation when in point of fact, they are symptoms of the environmental degradation. So in a nutshell, what I'm going to try to do tonight is rebrand a lot of these things that people call weeds or invasive species. And the term I like to use is cosmopolitan urban vegetation. This is the book, and I'm not actually trying to sell this book, but it covers 222 species, and you can see from the chart, about a third of them are native to North and Central America, 40% to Europe and Central America, 12% from Europe, 7% from Eurasia, and North America. So the vegetation that exists, that grows spontaneously, this is not the stuff that anybody planted, the stuff that grows by itself, is as cosmopolitan as the human population. There's nothing, you know, it is just a reflection of the urban environment itself. And this trend has been going on for a long time. You can see this graph. There's a famous book, Asa Gray published his manual of botany. When that came out in 1856, roughly 10% of the species that he described that were growing spontaneously in the Northeast were non-native to North America. By 1890, that figure was up to 15%. By 1908, 16%. By 1950, 20%. And we don't divide the world up the way Asa Gray did, but in the 1990s and 2000s, depending on which state you're talking about, the percentage of non-native species that are growing spontaneously varies from 25 or 24 to 35%. So this is a trend, okay? This is not going anywhere. This has been happening for a very long time, and it's really a symptom of the increasing globalization of the world that has been happening over the same period of time. And in much the same way that our economy has become globalized, so hasn't our ecology. It's really important to think about that. The other, very important idea I think that is critical is that this idea of what is urban. The typical, way of defining it is, by the density of the human population. In this case, this is 500 people per square mile. And so when we talk about the urbanized Northeast, we're not talking about sidewalk cracks. We're talking about a major, land mass that is, fully urbanized, and it's actually growing by leaps and bounds. This is not, of course, the East Coast. Anybody recognize where this city is? You see that river running through the middle of it in that ditch there. This is Los Angeles. And so one of the things about it is you can talk about what used to grow in this area before Los Angeles was built. That's the native species as a historical artifact. But in the terms of the concept of what is native to Los Angeles as it exists today, the answer is nothing. Everything that used to grow there has been wiped out. So this whole idea of a native species in the context of the conditions that exist today is very much a historical artifact. But we still are wedded to this idea of native and non-native. And we want to say the native species are more important than the non-native species. Yet in our urban environments, we have pushed all of the native species out. And a lot of them have come back, but so haven't a lot of non-native species. So in effect, the urban environment is what we call a novel ecosystem. It doesn't resemble anything that used to exist before the city did, and the ecology that exists in that urban area is totally distinct from what was there before. This environment has very distinct characteristics. Most of you have heard of the urban heat island effect, and this is a complicated graph, but on the vertical axis, that's the degrees difference between an urban and a non-urban or rural area at the same latitude. And then along the horizontal axis, that's the size of the city. And the temperature difference on a warm summer night is as much as 12 degrees centigrade. That's almost 21 or 22 degrees Fahrenheit. So cities have already, they're much warmer than the non-urban areas. And it's really important that we study cities because they have already heated up to the extent that is predicted for much of the rest of the area. So if you want to actually find out what climate change is going to look like, all you have to do is go into the city because it's already happened because of this urban heat island effect. And that difference in temperature is due primarily to all of the impervious surface that absorbs heat during the day and then radiates it out at night. And the culprit is really this amount of impervious surface that inhibits the penetration of water and completely changes everything. And this graph, I promise you this is my last complicated graph. And I apologize for showing you a picture of Boston, but you can see here that ring around Boston, that's Route 95, and this line of the horizontal axis is 0 to 100 kilometers. That goes from Boston downtown to the Harvard Forest in Petersham, Massachusetts, where I worked. And then 95, you see, is about 20 kilometers just to the west of Boston, and you can see that if everything, and each dot represents a plot that's 100 meters, square meters, 100 meters square, and it measures how much the percentage of impervious surface in that sample area, and everything that's inside that 95 beltway has 30% impervious surface or more, and then once you get on the other side of 95, it's pretty much with one exception, 25% impervious or less. The reason that this is an important slide is that this is another way of defining what urbanization is. And from a biological point of view, when you have 25% or 30% impervious surface, you have an urbanized condition regardless of how many people live there, because that impervious surface completely alters the drainage patterns on that piece of land, and when you alter the drainage patterns, you completely alter the vegetation. So there's actually a lot more urbanized land in the Northeast than we measured just by using the density of the human population. Now, I need to get a drink of water here. I like to analogize urbanization with glaciation, okay? The heavy equipment comes in, it essentially wipes everything out, and you go back to a state of primary succession, and it leaves in its wake compacted glacial till. No kidding, this is what it is. And when the landscapers come in, they put 2 inches of topsoil on there, they sow some grass seed, and that is primary succession. Everything has been wiped out. So this is really urbanization. It represents a total transformation of the landscape, not unlike what we see in glaciation. And this is, Boston, and you can see that the orange there is the original topography of Boston. The beige was filled in prior to 1880, and the blue was filled in after 1880. So roughly 1/6 of the land area for the city of Boston is built on fill. Okay, so it's not a city on a hill, it's a city on some fill. But, what I ask my students is, well, tell me, what is the native vegetation of filled soil? There is none. Okay, so this whole idea, of native and non-native in an urban context, all of a sudden it loses a lot of its meaning. So soil is a really important consideration when thinking about urban ecology. And one of the things we do with impunity in Boston, whenever there's the first flakes come out of the sky, we throw down tremendous amounts of salt. Nobody wants to compromise public safety for the sake of a few plants. But the plants know exactly what's going on, and the salt has a profound impact on soil chemistry and, by extension, soil biology. The plants know exactly, as I said, what's going on. And this plant, mugwort, which is sort of an iconic urban plant, comes from limestone areas in Europe. And, sodium chloride sodium ion is similar to the calcium ion. And so plants that grow naturally in high pH, limestone-rich soils actually do very well in areas that are heavily salted. So the plant is simply taking advantage of the conditions that we have created through the application of road salt. Another thing, of course, we like to proud ourselves on the back that we have dealt with the issue of acid precipitation or acid rain, and it has gotten much better than it certainly was in the 1980s. But the fact of the matter is the burning of fossil fuels always results in the deposition, either wet or dry, of nitrogen and sulfur compounds onto the land, onto the soil surface. And this graph is, again, of the Boston area. And this is the amount of deposition on an annual basis of nitrogen falling out of the sky every year. And my house is sort of right in the middle, so that's 11.0 kilograms per hectare. That translates roughly into pounds per acre of nitrogen every year falling out of the sky. Most of this is coming from automobiles. Okay, so the good news is, and I promised you I have good news, you don't have to fertilize your lawn anymore. This has profound impacts on the ecology because the native species, by and large, don't know what to do with this much nitrogen. The invasive species, on the other hand, they know exactly what to do when you give them a lot of nitrogen. They grow like crazy. So these are basic invisible changes that are happening in our ecology, but we're just not, aware of them, and we keep thinking that somehow or other we can go back in time and restore what used to be here, when in fact that is gone. That ship has left the dock, particularly in our urban areas. This is not something that people like to think about, but the reality is pretty much unassailable. The other thing, of course, about urban areas is they're highly fragmented through the creation of, roadways, driveways, houses, everything like that. And whenever you have you fragment the landscape, you create an edge, and that edge is usually dominated by species, I call them opportunistic species, that like disturbance. So the more fragmented the landscape is, the more disturbance-adapted species will take over. And this is based on some European studies. Americans are still playing catch-up with Europeans in terms of urban ecology, but urbanization favors species that grow well in soils that are relatively fertile, dry, unshaded, and alkaline. So this is the profile of your typical urban plant. This explains about 60% of the species that grow spontaneously in the cities. So this is what we have created, okay? And this idea that, it's bad because it wasn't native to North America when the Pilgrims landed, it's a crazy idea. I mean, I just don't, it makes no sense, because this whole idea of what was here in 1630 as a standard for what should be here in 2020, I don't understand it. But nevertheless, I'll keep going. So what's really important is what is happening in our environment is these ecosystems that are not native, there's native species in them, they're novel ecosystems. And this is a really useful concept because it explains what is actually happening in the world, regardless of what we think about it. So the interacting forces of urbanization, globalization, and climate change. It's these things interacting. It's not just one of them. Destabilizes native ecosystems and favor the spread of opportunistic species, both native and non-native. Water, air, and ground pollution impact soil chemistry, which impacts microbial activity, which impacts nutrient cycling, which impacts vegetation. So all of these are, and then finally, habitat fragmentation, or urban sprawl, creates sunny edges dominated by fast-growing, disturbance-adapted species. So this is actually the world in which we live. Now, I'm going to take you on a little trip now to Berlin. Berlin is a fascinating city because it was leveled during World War II, and the botanists that were in West Berlin, they couldn't leave the city because it was embedded in Eastern Germany, so they just began studying the succession process of how vegetation recolonized the rubble. And what's remarkable is you go there today and you still see a lot of these plants that we would call invasive species or weeds growing as part of the normal traditional landscape. So this is the Museum of Technology and Transportation, and that's the infamous Japanese knotweed. Can you imagine that in New York City? And the reason is that in Berlin, the city ordinance, actually it's its own municipal entity, has banned the use of herbicides. And what that means is it's a weedy city. You have to accept the weeds, okay? You can't say, I don't want to use herbicides, but I also want everything to be spotless and spick and span. And so what's really interesting is to wander around Berlin and look at what the landscape looks like and what happens when you stop using herbicides. So this is the interior part of the Museum of Transportation, and you see that red dot in the middle. That's where I took this photo. This is what the landscape looks like. This is a sort of an enclosed landscape. That's all full of hop vines and a wild assortment of weeds that were there when the museum was sort of a ruin. And they just left all this stuff there it's just part of this is the landscape. Tell me what the problem is with this. This represents nature. They call it urban nature. And I think that's a really important concept. And you go to these parks when the Russians built the wall dividing East and West Berlin, a lot of railroad tracks had nowhere to go, so they were just abandoned. And they left nature to take these railroad tracks over, and they are some of the most fabulous parks you ever want to see. This looks like some fancy estate in the Berkshires or something like that. Nomkeg is what I like to call it. And in the middle of the street, there's our famous the tree of heaven. Everybody knows that species, right? Ailanthus altissima. And there it is. That was left over, and they just left the trees there in the middle of the street as a planting. And I like to say, you all remember Mayor Bloomberg, right? You haven't forgotten him, right? So, and his, planting 10 million trees, right? And I think he did plant 10 million trees, but what I like to say is when he did it, he never counted the ailanthus trees. The ailanthus tree is the most common tree in the city of New York. If he had counted the ailanthus tree, he would only have had to plant 5 million trees. But the thing is this is actually a really important player in the ecology of New York City, yet because it's considered an invasive species, it is written out as though it didn't exist, and the only ailanthus is a dead ailanthus. And it's really crazy because these species have something to contribute to the overall ecology of the city. Now, the plants that grow in the city, and I've alluded to this, nothing is native to the city, but they're plants that come from areas in nature that resemble the kind of conditions you find in the urban environment. So I call that pre-adaptation. So, as I said, de-icing salts favor the spread of species that like calcium. So those come from, sort of limestone areas or from the shorelines. Floodplain trees perform well on urban streets, and the list goes on. It's a little bit too long, but you can get an idea. This is called pre-adaptation. So this is really important when you begin to think about where do these plants come from. So this is the ailanthus in its native habitat on the dry limestone hills around Beijing, growing exactly on the Great Wall of China, and there it is on the Great Wall next to the Arnold Arboretum. It has found its exact analog to its native habitat in the middle of downtown Boston. And what is a crumbling brick building if not a limestone cliff, as far as the plant is concerned? So this is all ecology that's happening before our very eyes, but because it involves these non-native species, we tend to dismiss them as bad. And it's that idea that there are good plants and bad plants that I really want to talk to you tonight about. Or this plant, curly dock. Here it is growing in Tuscany. You look out over the Tuscan landscape and you'd say, how beautiful, yet the same plant growing in New York City, well, it's not quite so beautiful. The epicenter for studying spontaneous vegetation, at least in the Northeast, is Detroit. And don't get me wrong, Detroit from a sociological point of view is an utter catastrophe. There's not enough work. The population has been shrinking dramatically since the 1960s. The problems that they have are tremendous, and they're beginning to make strides at solving some of them, but they've got a long way to go. And roughly 40% of the land area in Detroit is abandoned. That includes buildings as well as vacant land. And that is that is a very big number. Essentially, the land has lost its value. You can't turn it all into farms because a lot of it is contaminated. You can't turn it into parks because they don't have that kind of budget. So what are you going to do with all this vacant land in these so-called shrinking cities? From my perspective as a botanist, what's interesting about Detroit is that it's been abandoned for such a long time that you get a chance to see what the vegetation does when it's left alone. That's one of the things in a place like New York or Boston where property values are so high, nobody ever wants to leave anything alone. So nothing ever gets a chance really to develop. But it's quite extraordinary to see, you feel like you're in the middle of the countryside or this loading dock wetland, or the succession that takes place when you abandon a parking lot. All of these are very sort of natural processes that are happening. The critical thing that I really want to say to you tonight is that all of these plants, regardless of their nativity, are performing useful ecological services, whether we want to own up to it or not. Nutrient absorption in wetlands, heat reduction in paved areas, salt tolerance along roadways, drought tolerance on compacted soil, air pollution tolerance, food and habitat, erosion control. The list goes on and on. So quite the opposite, that these are bad plants that are somehow ruining our environment. They are actually helping to make the city more livable. all trees, regardless of where they come from, create shade, and that lowers temperatures. The sides of many of our rivers are held up, they're stabilized by trees, and it really, it would be a mistake to cut down these Norway maples because they weren't native when the Pilgrims landed. They are holding the Charles River bank up there. Or this plant, the autumn olive, was planted. I'm not a big fan of this plant, but it was planted in the 1970s for highway bankings and for wildlife habitat and for making jelly. And lo and behold, this plant is really good at all of those things, and it's spread like crazy. We planted this plant, and it did exactly what we asked it to do. And it is still doing what it was intended to do. This is, the floodplain. We've eliminated many of our floodplain areas, but this is the vegetation that grows in those floodplains is really important in dealing with, the changes in hydrology associated with climate change. And just, my last example of an ecological benefit, most of you are familiar with the Phragmites or the common reed, and here it is, along the New Jersey Turnpike, and you're supposed to say which exit. This is the Vince Lombardi exit, and you could look at that and you could say, oh my God, this European plant is, destroyed the New Jersey wetlands and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, if you did want to restore the salt marsh cordgrass that used to grow there, the solution is very, very simple and straightforward. You just remove the New Jersey Turnpike. You restore the tidal flow in that area, and the cordgrass will come back. In the meantime, this is what we got. There's over 500 landfills in this area that are leaking nitrogen and phosphorus, and this plant is cleaning them up. That's what I would say. It's really important that we recognize these things. This is off the Jersey City, where all the commuters from New Jersey used to take the ferry boat to Lower Manhattan before Robert Moses had his say, and it's been turned into a park, Liberty State Park. This is what it is, but that whole interior part of the park is fenced off because it's highly toxic. It was fenced off in the 1970s. The perimeter is a regular park, but what's amazing is if you go, you have a key, you can get into that area, you find that the vegetation has done a remarkable job in, I use the word loosely, cleaning it up, but what I really am talking about is they're growing, they're tolerant of these contaminants. A lot of them are petroleum-based, but there's quite a few heavy metals. But the process is called phytostabilization. They're binding these heavy metals with organic matter, and they are detoxifying the site. They're not cleaning it up to EPA standards, but they are essentially taking these heavy metals out of circulation. And this is research, a lot of it from Eastern Europe, showing that most of these spontaneous urban weeds, as I like to call them, are actually really good at absorbing heavy metals and taking them out of circulation. So it may look like a patch of weeds, but it's actually serving a very important function in terms of detoxifying these types of landscapes. And I'm going to end with just one little vignette. This is near the Arnold Arboretum. This is this area was abandoned, a 24-acre parcel near the Arboretum, leftover infrastructure. The wetland has been reduced to 40% of its original size, and it's pretty spectacular. It has a 300-year-old history, and I've spent a lot of time working on this site. This is an 8-foot diameter sewer drain that runs right through the middle of it. There's a 5-acre landfill on it. Railroad tracks run through it. It's a typical urban, roughed up site. But what's interesting is that the wetland is still there. The plants have actually sorted themselves out and formed a functional wetland. Even though none of these plants are native to North America, we've opened it up to the people, and it's actually a very popular walking, jogging, hiking path, and it connects the Arnold Arboretum to a major subway station. And we maintain the edges to keep it open and clear, but essentially that's all we do. And when you work with these types of landscapes, what's really important, it's a management process, and I call it intaglio, which is from engraving. It's design by removal. Okay, we think of landscapes as planting plants, but when you manage these types of landscapes, it's a different process. It's this design by removal, and the weed whacker becomes like a scalpel. You know, you whack the plants you don't want, you leave the ones you do, and you can really alter the trajectory of the landscape with a minimum amount of interference. And, you know, what do you remove? You remove vines. If you want trees, you really can't have vines. Anything that's a hazard to the public who might be there, you want to get rid of that. Plants that are unfriendly or unhealthy for people, you probably don't want those. And unsightly or aggressive plants that are perceived as indicators of dereliction or neglect. If you're in a low-income neighborhood, people don't like these plants because they indicate that nobody takes care of it. But that's really, you sort of thinking about it very differently. And this is my last slide. This is this brave new world we live in. And the challenge isn't to sort of wipe all this stuff out because it wasn't here when Columbus landed. It's how do we actually learn to work with this vegetation to increase its aesthetic and ecological functionality. So thank you very much for your attention.